In the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to discuss with you our network approach to assessing the risk of HIV transmission in MSM. So to this day, I think we all agree that MSM accounts for a major proportion of HIV infected individuals around the world, as shown in this particular map, even though this one was actually published almost 10 years ago. I think it's still correct. And if we look at Hong Kong, Hong Kong is a very small place, but if you look at these light blue bars, you can see that a good majority of reported HIV infection in Hong Kong were from MSM. So this happened from 2007, and then in the past 2 years, there seems to be a little plateau. We are still not too sure whether this is going to come down or it's going to go up. But if you exclude the cases which have no known routes of transmission as they cannot be obtained from the health department, actually almost 3/4 of all newly diagnosed HIV infection were MSM. So to describe and also to project the HIV transmission pattern in this particular population, we're looking at not just the HIV status, but also look at the behavioral risk, look at the exposure risk, because without the exposure, even if somebody has got a certain high-risk behavior, it doesn't mean that he would go into HIV infection. And then, of course, the virus burden in the HIV infected population. So, but MSM do not form a homogeneous population. I think that's a very key message there. If there's one thing I consider most important in my presentation, this is the one. This is not a homogeneous population. If we say there's an HIV epidemic in MSM out there, it only means that this happens when you can see that the proportion is really big, and this is going to be highly sensitive to the connective topology of the particular population, because if there's a very small group, if the connections are not there, then the HIV transmission and then the epidemic will happen. So that leads me to a few studies, a series of studies we have been backing ourselves on, and in fact we're still continuing doing that in the past 10 years. One important project is what I call the new Cases Cohort, meaning that we, with the consent of HIV positive individuals, when they're newly diagnosed from any one of the HIV specialist clinics in Hong Kong, we obtain a blood sample to do the sequencing, the GRT sequence. We collected the behavioral clinical data, and with those, we built a data set, we built a research database, and then started our analysis using what I call the network-based approach. So this is the results that we obtained in the last 2 years, or 2 to 4 years, between 2016 and 2018, using a genetic distance threshold of 1.5%. I think genetic network would be one of the forms the easiest to understand and easiest to convey in describing the epidemiology. So in this particular network, we found 47 clusters, half of them dias, meaning just 2 persons, which do not normally have a lot of epidemic potential. But they are bigger clusters, and also the predominance of genotypes AE in this entire population. But mind you that this is not just MSM, but also people got the infection from other routes. Visually, with this graph, we show on the left-hand side the routes of transmission, and on the right-hand side the particular genotypes. You can see here that actually MSM now appear very prominently as an important group with clusters in this cohort of newly diagnosed patients. And then we see not just subtype B, but also AE and BC in the whole HIV infected populations among the MSM. So since we have been working on this for about 10 years now, we have collected an archive of sequences from previous years. So it will be interesting, in fact, to know how has the epidemic grown. Have they grown from the past infection linking to new ones, or the new ones totally brand new unrelated to the past infections? So this is the study. You can see that the blue dots are actually the archived sequences, the HIV infected people who got the infection about 10 or 5 years ago. Whereas the yellow ones, the newly diagnosed ones, between 2016 and 2018, as I showed in the previous slide, you see that the old ones are linked among themselves, and the new ones could be isolated on their own, but they are ones that are linked between the archive samples and also the newly diagnosed HIV infections. If you look at the linkages, so we can classify these newly diagnosed cases in two populations. One are the archive sequences just linked with the new cases, and the others are the newly diagnosed cases which are linked with the archive cases. They are not entirely the same, but they came with the same conclusion, is that if you look at those linked archive sequences, meaning the previously diagnosed HIV infections, if they're linked with the new cases, they are relatively young, they are MSM, and then they have they are less likely to have been infected through other routes, because this is an entire population covering everyone in this particular cohort. And then for the newly diagnosed HIV cases linked to archive cases, they are more likely to subtype B and younger people. Now, let us look at the MSM exclusively. So we divide MSM's clusters into either they're clusters with new cases on the left-hand column, or clusters without new cases. So these are the social network metrics that should be very familiar to social network analysts. For us, or for people working on epidemiology, it might be more interesting to look at some measures that allow us to assess the severity of the epidemic in terms of the speed of the spread, the range, meaning how far this transmission will go on, and the scale. Perhaps one person linking with many persons, that will be a very wide scale. So you can see here that for clusters with new cases, invariably they have a broader range, higher speed, and larger scale. So that is a bit worrying, even though I said the epidemic seems to be coming to a little plateau, but as a matter of fact, we are seeing it gaining momentum in terms of the range, the speed, and scale of the transmission. If you compare between the connected ones and the unconnected ones, again, you see that the connected ones are more likely to be people who have the infection, who got the infection locally, as we derive from the questionnaires, asking specifically where did they think they got the infection from, and they are younger, and then they have been using internet or the mobile apps for sex networking, and then these mobile apps are international gay mobile apps rather than the mobile apps which are commonly used in mainland China. They represent two different populations. One, they are connected in the transmission network, the others are not. But where, when, and how did the HIV negatives meet the HIV positive? That was our actually initial questions when doing all these studies, and that started us to work on another research on looking at the affiliation of MSM, HIV positive MSM. So this study we started about 10 years ago. We are still continuing in different ways by defining first where they went for sex partnership. So we came up with a whole range of different platforms, including physical venues and internet, meaning virtual venues. And then by using a larger scale, we are able to describe in very detailed ways how people would like to seek their sex partners before the HIV diagnosis. So that reminds me to just say a few words on two-mode networks, because that will be a very good data set to analyze the networks in what we call the two-mode forms, instead of the usual one-mode network that it comprises only individuals. But here we have another mode, which is the place where people meet. So we are assuming that even though we don't know whether two persons are really connected, but if they happen to be the same place at the same time, we assume that they are connected. That's the principles of two-mode network analysis. And then you can see here that among the 84 recently diagnosed HIV positive MSM, you can see that there are 2 to 3 big groups. One, if you look at the red dots, which are the places where they meet, and yellow dots are the HIV positive MSM themselves. So either they are linked through internet, or they are linked through different physical platforms, or of course there's some in between who are linked in different platforms. And again, that also highlights the heterogeneity of the MSM population, because there are what we call the internet-based MSM and also solid-based MSMs when it comes to sex networkings. And the internet-based MSMs are normally younger, high education level, and have a bigger and a broader variety of partner types. And while we are looking at these two mode networks, don't forget the other mode, which is the physical venues. And in fact, you can say that, or we can argue that the physical venues or the virtual venues, they are also linked in some ways. So here is a map showing the linkages of these saunas in terms of persons. The thicker lines here, meaning there are more people going to this sauna F and sauna K, and less going to sauna H and sauna A. So you see that there's some core saunas, and I think this type of information will be quite important when it comes to interventions, where we would like to see where are the places where people will meet and might have high-risk sexual behaviors. And then this is the hierarchy, very much like phylogeny, to show the places where they favor, where they will go to. But in fact, when we are analyzing these two mode networks, we can't stop ourselves from thinking about what are the characteristics that attract a person to go to a particular venue. Is this all just because of that particular venue's characteristics, or is something else? That's how we came to the concept of phenotypes. So there must be people who like to link up with other people, and this body image type is pretty common in the community. And then MSMs are defining themselves as a different body image type, like bear type, chubby type, or the other types as seen in this particular box. And then with analysis that I show here, their different types can be more linked or less linked to the other types, and that divide people into different categories. And interestingly, if you look at these body image types, in fact, they also attended different types of physical venues, and they explain the concepts of how they came to know one another and where they had sex, and how had this heterogeneity of sex networking contributed to the very diverse way the HIV epidemics has progressed. But don't forget that all this changed with time. So in another series of studies, we look at what happened when a person is HIV diagnosed. After diagnosis, did things remain all the same? So if you look at sex networking and also look at the HIV care they're receiving, you see that a year after diagnosis, actually most of the people would have reduced number of encounters in these sex networking venues. But all this will continue to change. Say after 2 years, in fact, over 100%, it's not over, it's almost 100% would visit the sex networking venues again. So it's a change from a period shortly after HIV diagnosis, when people are on treatment, are beginning to on treatment. There's more condom use, less partnership, and then less sex networking. And then about 2 years later, it all went back to what we call the normal mode again. So, but important to see here that there's another thing that is happening, which is treatment. If the coverage is good, in fact, the treatment coverage is quite good in Hong Kong at the HIV treatment services. We can see that most of the people have bowel low suppressed. So even though the sex networking practice behaviors has gone back to the similar type of frequency, similar mode as before HIV transmission, but the risk of HIV spread should not be very high if most people have got HIV treatment received. So this is just a graph showing the change. On the left-hand side, the type of venues we will go to, and then on the right-hand side, the same venues that people went to after HIV diagnosis. So you see that the profile changed over time. And in fact, new networks are formed. So after HIV diagnosis, and it's also coincide with what I've been discussing about change over time. So this is a graph showing acute hepatitis C infection, HIV infected MSM. You see here that on the x-axis we have the year of diagnosis of HIV infection, whereas on the y-axis we have the year diagnosis of hepatitis C. If all these are hepatitis C infected HIV positive MSM, you see here that they are diagnosed with HIV at different times. So probably they didn't know one another. But they are diagnosed with hepatitis C almost in the same window of 2 to 3 years. So it means that they are forming a new network as a result of zero sorting. And even though this does not actually increase HIV transmission risk, but increase the risk of transmission of other sexually transmitted infections, including hepatitis C. When we looked at the phylogenetic tree, we are surprised to find a monophyletic pattern of almost exclusively genotype 3A when we started doing this study about 5 years ago. And then with all these black dots that we identified as HIV positive cases. And then with this, they continue to grow. And then this hepatitis C continue to grow, not just in this monophyletic cluster, but also in a new cluster from the genotype 1A. So networks continue to grow. It's not static, it's a very dynamic process. But if you look at the HIV negative MSM, the hepatitis C positive rate is very low. And in this particular study, interesting to find that the hepatitis C in the HIV positive MSMs are genotype 3A, whereas the hepatitis C in HIV negative MSM belong to another type. So those are different categories of people, different networks, and different transmission rates that we can see. And in fact, different when we compare between Hong Kong, Taipei, and Tokyo, whereas we had a monophyletic 3A genotype. The Tokyo is composed of 2 genotypes, whereas in Taipei it's very diverse. So networking could be very, very local. And when it comes to PrEP use, it's even more because there are all these different factors that MSM might consider when they went into the youth, when they wanted to assess PrEP. And the factors associated with awareness may not necessarily be identical factors associated with PrEP acceptance. So those are the important things that perhaps in the next few years we are going to focus on, because this is one of the factors that can protect one persons from infection rather than looking into always the risk of further transmission. So summarizing the results, the network-based approach allows us to look at the characteristics in 3 different ways. One is, of course, the connectivity through affiliation networks, through the partnership type, through the zero adaptation. And the other is the virus burden. With the clinical data, we know that what proportion continue to be at risk. And finally, the preventive behaviors like PrEP and condom use. So this is the conclusion I've said. One most important observation or one thing that we are confirming is the heterogeneity of the transmission pattern. And then the network-based approach offers a very good means of analysis. And then this provides data for our modeling in projecting into future. So finally, let me thank my colleagues who have been helping me to do all this research in the past 10 years. And the research grants that supported us, they're all from Hong Kong. And then our collaborators from different HIV services. Thank you.